to their credit, the founders of Israel were fucking savages. They crushed because they were fighting for their very existence. And they had just come out of a revolution of what I would characterize, and Israel later characterized, as terrorism. But all these intelligence agencies are in bed together. You know, the CIA was founded on the back of Mossad. They've been leaning on Mossad ever since their first day as an agency. They're not super different, though they do, you know, serve sort of different interests at the more granular levels for sure.
You know, they hate each other though, right?
Oh, I would imagine that most of those officers hate each other, but like, do the higher ups hate each other? Do the banker overlords that kind of have a lot of influence up there? Do like those sorts of folks that, and banker overlords sounds really conspiratorial. What I mean by that is like, there are people that can walk into the CIA director's office with a single phone call. Right?
Yes.
And those people have a lot of influence over the whole organization of the CIA, whether we like it or not. And they shouldn't, but they do. And so those higher level positions, I'm not sure they would necessarily share those same grudges that the regular officers and people in the organization would. But I don't know. Right? I just know that like for the history of the CIA, there's a long history that's pretty well documented of we don't know how to gather intelligence on fucking the USSR because we can't get anyone in there. But this Jewish agency, because the thing about Mossad and about Israel in general is that Jews are so unique in that they are a diaspora people. They're everywhere, right? And they are already pre-blended into every culture in the world for the most part, although they are, you know,
many cultures,
deeply reviled by many of them and treated like shit by many of them. And, you know, there is a whole long story there, obviously. But for that reason, Mossad and Israel, they have Jewish people in lots of these countries that need to be spied on, that already blend in, that already have the same skin color, that already have the same cultural background, that are already there. And so the CIA for a long time was just going to Mossad and buying intelligence because the CIA couldn't get someone into fucking Africa, but Mossad already had people in place in some situations. So like, and that is a you know, repeated story. And Angleton, James Jesus Angleton, is a
Angleton was tied to
right
them
there.
at the beginning. Yeah.
I mean, Angleton.
Can you tell people who he was?
James Jesus Angleton was the counterintelligence czar in the early, you know, first couple decades of the CIA, and he's a instrumental figure in the CIA's founding and history.
Yes.
And particularly, he's an instrumental figure in the Red Scare and in the CIA's relationship with Russia, well, the USSR, because counterintelligence, meaning he was in charge of, you know, counterintelligence against the USSR, infiltrating us, spying on us. He was trying to spy on the USSR and spy on, like, block their spies, right? And he was, when you read like the actual documentation about him, he was deeply paranoid about USSR moles to the point of psychosis in a certain way. Like, my words, not, you know, but he like to the point where my personal theory is I suspect that he was creating Red Scare where it didn't exist in order to create a smokescreen for all sorts of other dirty operations, and a lot of pro-Israel kind of stuff kind of linked into CIA operations at the time, because his allegiance was clearly dual in some regard. And I don't necessarily mean to say he was for sure more loyal to Israel than America, but there was certainly a strong allegiance to Israel, and Israel honored him with this like big ceremonial grave. He's like a hugely important figure in their history that they love and respect very much.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know. I'm open to that.
Yeah.
Like studying his life. My read on it was more he thought that they were really useful for things he did, and then in the process also got used and maybe didn't realize it. Like, I think I actually would agree with the word you used there of like a psychosis towards it. I think that's probably very fair, because he was one, like we were saying earlier, he was one of those founding guys who they just reviled communism so much that it would blind them in anything else where they could have, you know,
and he couldn't get
overlook something.
He could not get people into the USSR. Yeah. The early CIA was completely inept at getting any form of solid intelligence on the USSR. But the other aspect of the early CIA, and the Legacy of Ashes does a great job of elucidating
Tim
this
Weiner's
with primary sources to back it up, is that the CIA was on pins and needles for its whole like first 3 decades of life, because like they were not every president loved them, right? Like right from the very start, it was like they didn't even have a mandate for the first couple of years of like, what are we even doing? They had no authority, they had no budget at first, and there's the future of the CIA was in no way certain, and a lot of that is the history of Alan Dulles sort of fighting for that future, right? And so they needed to be producing evidence and information, right? And for a while they just would lie. And they would make up evidence, and if they could, or they would buy evidence. They would just like, because they needed to show their utility, right? And Angleton, I think, my understanding of the history is that a lot of Angleton's information was either made up or deeply cloudy, or he would like deeply exaggerate. And Wiener actually cites like direct quotes from official documentation where he would say he had 40 sources in the USSR. I'm making up numbers, but Wiener has the real quotes. Like he would say he has all these fucking sources in the USSR when he has like a garbage man and a radio worker or some bullshit, right? And the whole point of that is that like is understanding the frailty and ineptitude of especially the early CIA as well as like the mid, it's not a perfect like Illuminati level organization. They are just, it's an organization made out of flawed people that are deeply corrupt in a lot of ways at the top. And so understanding that is a really important layer of color to understanding why and how they did what they did throughout their history and being founded, right?
Yeah. And I think, you pointed out that there's ties there at the beginning where like it kind of comes together and it's like, okay, CIA, MSAD. There was also, who the hell was telling me this? Someone recently was talking to me about this who would know, but they were explaining how like, I think it was Bustamante. He was like, a lot of the tactics it was a one-way street. A lot of the tactics at CIA were taught to Mossad. Mossad took that and ran with it, and they didn't come and teach us their tactics or whatever. Yeah. And then they would do that to a lot of different places, and that's how they developed so strongly at the beginning after the founding of Israel.
And it's also important to note that, like, to their credit, the founders of Israel were fucking savages. They crushed because they were fighting for their very existence. And they had just come out of a revolution of what I would characterize, and Israel later characterized as terrorism.
Talking about the Irgun.
Yeah, the Irgun and the Lehigh, and to a certain extent the Haganah. And they were revolutionaries fighting for their lives and their whole people and their whole religion's existence. And so they were experienced in a way that the early CIA officers were fucking not. Yes. The early CIA officers were like green kids from America that had cushy ass lives that had never, some of them were war vets from World War II and stuff like that. But Bill Donovan had run a fucking wacky ass OSS organization in World War II. He was like trying to strap bombs to bats to go like bat bomb the world. And then like they accidentally fucking put the wrong fuses on and all the bats exploded on the runway. Shit like that, where it's like, if you were in the OSS during World War II, yeah, you were hardened, but you were hardened in this weird, wacky way that was not the same as successfully founding a nation in the most hostile territory in the world, right?
You got chewed out. I've been chewed out before.
So early Israel was made out of very shrewd people that had a lot of very strong experience, in my understanding, whereas the CIA did not. And so there's a funny imbalance in those early days, and we haven't even touched on the alliance that formed with organized crime on both sides of that equation early on, right? As in the CIA.
Yeah, can you explain?
So before you even get to the CIA, J. Edgar Hoover, the founder of the FBI, he was compromised from somewhere in the 30s and 40s when photos were acquired by Meyer Lansky and the mob, and then obviously shared with the mafia and all that.
He was cross-dressing.
Yeah, mob and the mafia. He was a cross-dresser that liked boys, and particularly his gay lover, Clyde Tolson, who was his second in command, and it was an open secret in the world of the FBI and beyond. But then he started to be blackmailed by organized crime, mob and mafia. And then he started throwing these cross-dressing parties at the Blue Suite in the Plaza Hotel and possibly other places. We don't know. That's just one of the most documented cases. And so he was throwing these blackmail parties where he was collecting blackmail on everyone else because he was fucking super paranoid and super blackmail-y. But they were all getting blackmail on him the whole time too. And so it was this like blackmail alliance between the FBI, which is the law enforcement organization that is designed to go after the mob and the mafia, and he's working with them from that day forwards, basically. And, you kind of wonder why suddenly the mob and the mafia go from like, prohibition really helped because they're a bunch of little gangs, and then suddenly like all these gangs that are running like, just running clubs and all this stuff, make liquor illegal, and they suddenly become an international crime syndicate.
It was a gold rush,
globalizes, dude. Right?
Yes.
They get super fucking rich, and then they get blackmail on the FBI, which is supposed to be policing them, and then they just go ham through the whole. And that's where we get all these mafia movies, all these mobsters, right? All these Tommy guns.
That's how we get that skyline.
New York City. That's how we get Las Vegas, right? That's how we get Hollywood and the music industry in a lot of senses. All that money just flowed into forming this modern American system, and to this day, I would argue it is still there. But so the FBI was deeply corrupt already and in bed with the mob and the mafia. But then when the CIA was founded, one of their first operations, because CIA, and ideally they were supposed to just be providing a newspaper of information. That was sort of like the first, ask. But what Dulles always wanted was covert operations, the ability to go overthrow governments on behalf of his corporate buddies, for example.
Yes.
And one of their first operations was in Italy, because Italy was, Mussolini and World War II. Italy, not to mention it's the seat of the Vatican, the seat of Catholicism, the seat of this Western ideal, right? So you can't let that fucking fall to communism. So it was like the second or third year, something like that. They go out to, fix the elections in Italy. And that was basically just them passing duffel bags full of cash to mafia. And the mafia just going and paying off a whole bunch of politicians and buying the elections. And they won. It would have been like 47 to 49, something like that.
Yeah,
Again,
so
I'm citing Wiener.
This is Calavizzini after he helped them across. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And Wiener has a great section on that early on in his book. And that was one of the first times, it was one of the first CIA operations. He claims it was the first official CIA covert operation. There's dispute about which came first, the overthrow or the overthrow, because then they quickly went to Guatemala and, overthrew Guatemala. A little less organized crime involved in that. But
yeah, there's some interesting stories with the president there.
Yeah, but I mean, I already skipped over Operation Underworld, where the OSS during World War II.
Lucky Luciano.
Yeah, there's this boat, I think it was the Lusitania, right, that blew up in. I might be borrowing Lusitania from another story here.
But you're right. German U-boats were they blew up a boat. It had to do with it's coming back to me. It had to do with the New York ports and everything. So Lucky.
It was in port there, yeah.
Yes, Lucky Luciano is up in Siberia at this point at Dannemora. He's the most powerful mob boss probably in history. But he's up there. He had been put there on tax evasion charges by what's his face, the guy Dewey, who later ran for president and lost. And so the U.S. government goes to him through intermediaries at first to say, hey, number one, we need our ports fixed. So they did that. The mob helped protect
and
the
the reason
ports.
why they would do that is because the mob and the mafia ran all the labor unions.
That's
and the
correct.
labor unions ran all the ports.
They needed intel.
And so the boat gets bombed in the port and they're like, fuck, the German U-boats are coming for us in our ports and we can't even lock them down.
Yep.
Mob and the mafia's already got them locked down. Just ask them to do it for us, right?
They're patriots too.
Bingo, right? And so literally the OSS, the US government, the State Department, whatever, whoever is in that party, they just go to them and form an alliance and they basically hand over the control of the entire US Eastern Seaboard.
That's right.
To organized crime. And what does organized crime love to do? They love to put illegal things on boats and ship them in and out of ports. So right from World War II, before we'd even founded the CIA, we're already in bed with organized crime in a big way. And that only accelerates with the founding of the CIA. And then you get things like the smuggling of heroin in Laos, the smuggling of crack and cocaine in the Iran-Contra scandal. I would argue Afghanistan as well with heroin.
I mean, there's no doubt about that. You hear what John Kiriakou said about that?
No, I don't think so. In here?
Yeah.
I love Kiriakou. He's a wealth.
Kiriakou, the first time he was in here, we recorded in October. And he tells this whole story about, I'm in Afghanistan, 2009.
Good voice.
I go there to investigate the poppy fields. I say, take me there. And he runs through this whole thing, and I'm sitting here like, wow, yeah, this is a wild story. It's not surprising or whatever. Little did I know he was blowing the whistle on the whole USAID thing. I had no idea.
Right.
So then fast forward 4 months later, that comes out, and people are like, yeah, this fucking idiot podcaster had in Kiriakou, and he was talking about the whole thing. I'm like, damn it, how did I miss that? But you're 100% right. Yeah. There was some weird shit going on there. And what John says is that, and this is where it's a real poison pill question, he from what he found out, they were doing it to fund getting Russians and Iranians addicted to heroin. And the logic was they do it to us. And I'm like, ooh.
They would, but is that really, is the blowback worth it?
That's the idea.
Because when you look at, and I am no mathematician, but when you look at the statistics from the time, just basic statistics, choose your source or whatever, something like 90% of the world's heroin or opiate supply at the time, because it used to be most of it coming from the Golden Triangle over in Laos, Vietnam area, transitioned, and most of it was now coming from the Afghanistan area, right? And so if about 90%, give or take, is coming from Afghanistan, world supply of opiates, including all the legal ones, then that implies that all of the legal pharmaceutical companies are sourcing the same opiates from those same fields that were opened back up by our same U.S. government covert operations over there. And so then those covert operations, those black operations that are smuggling the heroin in and out of there for whatever they were doing, they're side by side with those opiate companies, with the Sackler family and all that.
It's disgusting.
It's disgusting, right? Yeah. And so that's that same merger of, and this is just speculation, but the question is, Was there collusion? Did they know in advance of like, hey, you're going to get a piece of this pie and we're going to get a piece of this pie. You're going to help us run these opium fields and we're going to help run these opium fields. Or was it just incidental that now the CIA and the US government has overthrown the Taliban? They've opened back up the poppy fields. They've got all the production. And then the pharma companies come in just knowing nothing about it. And they're just buying the supply for their totally safe, non-addictive opioids that killed like half our fucking generation. Obvious
legalized cartel.
Yeah. Super tragic and especially personal to our generation.
Oh, yeah.
Where like we all lost friends to that shit. We watched people disappear from reality to that shit.
Hanging out there.
Yeah. And we're still feeling the effects of that to this day as we move into the fentanyl crisis, which is obviously a different beast and a different, political situation. But it's always these sort of like, and opium is one of the deepest threads to follow throughout history, all the way from the British Empire and the opium wars in China and shit, all the way through to today. Opium has always been one of the most powerful covert operation tools to use against countries, one of the most powerful money-making tools to fund, whatever it is you're funding. Like there was a time, I'm going to forget the statistic, but they're like back during the British Empire, when they were smuggling opium from India into China, and then later the opium wars came up, like, I forget the stat, but it was something like 20% of the British Empire's money was income from opium sales. Huge percentage. Like double check those numbers. It is in one of the Wikipedia pages about that whole thing, but obviously you need to go deeper to get like I'm sure there's variance on the stats. But it like
either way, it's
the British Empire made a fuckload of money off of opium back in their colonial days, and that still is a story to this day.
Yeah, it's especially when you get into like today with like what you brought up, the Sackler stuff. It makes your stomach turn because again, that's where we've been talking about the corporate interests having deep ties to be able to get things done. Like there's a prime example right there. Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.